Today, when you watch meetings of G7 leaders, it's like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But we must thank one gentleman for significantly improving China-India relations. And this is the gentleman, he said, whose name I should not mention. There was David Frost interviewing George H.W. Bush. And David Frost asked George H.W. Bush, you met so many world leaders. Who's the one world leader who impressed you the most? Within a split second, George H.W. Bush said, Lee Kuan Yew.
You mentioned several times about the restructuring of the Security Council, but I think on record, if I'm not mistaken, actually the US, Russia, UK, and France are in support of India's rise to be accepted into the Security Council as permanent member. But I think on the record, actually China is the only one which stands in the way. Am I correct?
But the most brilliant ambassador to the UN, I remember, was the Italian ambassador, because in the 1990s, when everybody was pushing for Japan and Germany to become permanent members, the Italian ambassador got very upset. He says, why are you pushing only for Japan and Germany? We, Italy, we lost World War II also.
大家好，我是老吴。上一期节目我们分享了马凯硕教授关于东升西降的系统性演讲。今天这期我们接着来看演讲后更有意思的互动部分，他和主持人丹尼尔、贝尔教授的对话，以及最后的现场问答。如果说上一期的演讲展现的是马凯硕作为战略家的严谨和深刻，那么这段内容就更多的展现了他作为智者的风趣、坦率和个人魅力。这段对话内容非常丰富，也很有意思。比如他会怎么评价特朗普上台后对世界局势带来的戏剧性冲击，再比如他最欣赏的政治领袖是谁。整场对话金句不断，充满了真知灼见，非常值得一听。好，接下来就让我们进入这场轻松而深刻的对话。
So thank you, Kishore, for the wonderful talk. And normally as a commentator, or I'm supposed to disagree, but frankly I don't disagree with anything you say. So let me push it in a few directions. First of all, here in Hong Kong we strongly value the freedom of speech, but I'm going to ask for one tiny little constraint, because as you know, my home country is Canada, and we've been subject to unprovoked bullying by a large neighbor to the south. So please don't mention the name of that political leader, otherwise I might have a panic attack. So that's the one constraint, and I'm glad you didn't mention it just now. So other than that, feel free to say anything. The first, if the Security Council is so difficult to reform, what about alternative international organizations? Maybe that's where there's more promise. Do you have any ideas about that? Is it BRICS or which would it be? If the it sounds like the Security Council really is almost impossible to reform. Even today, frankly, like there's no political representatives from Europe, or from North America. So they're not really open to this sort of suggestion, it seems to me. So maybe we need to look outside that and think of alternative organizations. Could you any ideas about that?
Well, you're absolutely right. By the way, I'm glad you mentioned you're from Canada. I should add I'm an honorary Canadian since I got my master's degree from Dalhousie, and I also spent 10 years serving as a non-resident High Commissioner of Singapore to Canada. So I've discovered, by the way, that I'm sure many of you know that Canada is one of the nicest countries in the world. And suddenly Canada discovers that being nice to your neighbor for 50, 60 years means nothing. And in some ways, I'm glad you raised that issue, because there's one point I didn't emphasize at the beginning of my remarks, which is that geopolitics is the most cruel game in the world. And we are today, in terms of geopolitical shifts of power, experiencing far more geopolitical shifts of power, and I give you some example, than any other time. And it's very important, therefore, for countries, even nice countries like Canada, have got to understand that being nice is not enough. That you've got to learn to be very geopolitically shrewd and cunning and Machiavellian if you're going to survive in this world. And I would say in terms of our world order, you're absolutely right. it is very difficult to adapt the established top-level institutions, UN, IMF, and so on and so forth. There are other institutions that are rising in an ad hoc fashion. And clearly among these organizations, some are sunrise and some are sunset. So I give you the obvious example. Until recently, one of the most powerful organizations was the G7 countries, right? It was the United States and 6 other European members plus the European Union. And at one time, when the leaders met, all the G7 leaders looked equally strong. Today, when you watch meetings of G7 leaders, it's like Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. And I'm not even exaggerating. And I mean, one of the photographs that will go down as one of the defining moments of the 21st century is the photograph you saw recently of President Donald Trump in his White House, sitting at the desk. And all the European leaders were sitting in the sofa like children in front of their school teacher. I mean, that photograph was so damning. And this is the same Europe that says, we will not give up our seats, we are very powerful. They behave like school children. But that's an illustration of how power shifts have happened. By contrast, if you look at BRICS, right? BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's clearly a sunrise organization because a lot of countries are applying to join, right? It's interesting. No one is applying to join the G7, but the BRICS, everyone is writing. But that's an example of how power is also shifting. But there are also another important organization which I think right now is having a rough time, which is the G20. The G20 at the end of the day will become more significant in the decades to come. And the G20, as you know, was formed as a result of a global financial crisis. And initially, only the finance ministers used to meet. But after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, even George W. Bush convened a meeting of the G20 leaders to try and deal with the global financial crisis. So that's an example of how there are various forms of adaptation taking place. But these forms of adaptation are not enough. So it's important, therefore, for especially the Asian countries to work harder to say that their voice must be represented much more strongly.
Okay, great. One question, the two huge powers that could pose an alternative to a kind of West-centric order, obviously are China and India. And you know both countries very well, and you're sympathetic to both, which is kind of rare. And the ties seem to be improving now. What can they do further to improve ties, to form some sort of G2 again? Any suggestions along those lines?
Well, I mean, the China-India relationship, I think you should all know, is very complicated. And right now, well, actually until about 3-4 months ago, relations between China and India, they were not bad, they were very bad. I mean, they were not talking to each other, right? I mean, I'm sure you're all aware that after the clash that took place in Galwan in June 2020, China and India ties went in the nosedive. Fortunately, in the last few months, step by step, their ties have been improving. And I think it's likely that Prime Minister Modi is going to go to China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, I think, at the end of this month. And that's a big deal. It's a really big deal that the Prime Minister of India is going back to China. But I think for the China-India relationship to improve, a lot more work needs to be done by both sides. And here I must say that if I had been giving this talk here even 4 months ago, I would have been very pessimistic about China-India relations. But we must thank one gentleman for significantly improving China-India relations. And this is the gentleman, he said whose name I should not mention. But I have to give credit where it's due. And President Donald Trump's decision to impose a 50% tariff on India is one of the biggest shocks that India has ever got in recent times. But more than that, you know, as you all aware, India and Pakistan also had a military clash a month or two ago. And after the military clash, President Donald Trump invited the Chief of Army of Pakistan for a special White House lunch. And the Indians saw this as a slap in the face for them. And so there is now, even as we are speaking, a tremendous amount of evaluation going on in Delhi about where India's place in the world is. And yeah, we are now in the midst, so you're going to watch a kind of a transition that is happening. So on the China-India front, hopefully things will be much better by the end of this year.
Great, thank you. So a few more minutes left and then we open it to Q&A. One little question about Hong Kong, since we have many people here from Hong Kong. I mean, as you know, the one country, two systems, it pulls in opposite direction, or at least seemingly opposite direction. So my first question is, how can Hong Kong strengthen its commitment, its national identity, its commitment to China as a political identity without weakening the two systems? Any suggestions along those lines?
Well, I think the one country, two system is actually a brilliant solution to the question of how you integrate Hong Kong into China. And I think that the important thing is that I believe China realizes that Hong Kong is a better asset to China if it actually keeps its differences rather than dissolving the differences and becoming just like any other Chinese town or city. And in fact, it's the differentiation therefore becomes an asset to China. So if you can keep up your British, what they call common law traditions, which is what we have in Singapore also, and you keep that going and you keep up your modern business practices and everything, Hong Kong is therefore a bigger asset to China. But it's important, therefore, that the leaders of Hong Kong communicate that much more strongly, both domestically and internationally. Because I think that, frankly, and my sense is that at the end of the day, Beijing wants Hong Kong to succeed.
Sure.
And part of the reason why Beijing wants Hong Kong to succeed is because the United States doesn't want Hong Kong to succeed. I mean, it's a fact. I mean, I told you earlier on that geopolitics is a cruel business, right? In some ways, paradoxically, incidentally, because President Trump is one of the least ideological presidents of recent times, he, as you know, he doesn't pay much attention to issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan, but his predecessor did. And so, for that reason, if China sees that Hong Kong is under threat, it's in China's interest to see the success of Hong Kong. But one last point about people in Hong Kong, and I've used this analogy before. In the US-China contest, Hong Kong is going to become a political football. And if you are going to be caught in a geopolitical game, the Hong Kong establishment must develop geopolitical instincts and understand the game that is being played, and then understand sometimes when to dodge, when the arrows are coming.
Great. We're rapidly running out of time, so let me ask a few quick, more personal questions and also with quick answers if you don't mind. I loved your memoirs, as you know, and there's a few things about it that I want to ask a little bit. First of all, you mentioned that you were kind of fond of Karl Marx, and also in your interview with Brian, you also mentioned that. So can you go a little bit more detail? Which part of Marx do you like? Is it theory of alienation, of exploitation? Is it communism as a higher ideal? What part of Marx do you like?
Have you got 3 hours?
Just 1 minute, please.
Well, I mean, I was, I wrote my master's thesis comparing the concepts of freedom and equality in the writings of Karl Marx and John Rawls. John Rawls, by the way, is the greatest American philosopher of the 20th century, brilliant guy. And when I started my research, I thought my sympathies would be more with John Rawls than with Karl Marx. I ended up actually sympathizing with Karl Marx more. Because Karl Marx will go down in history as probably the most brilliant thinker on social and political issues. So his whole concept of substructure and superstructure. So we all think that the way we think about our society is a result of our imagination, rationality, and all that. He said, no. What emerges in your society is a consequence of the economic distribution of power. And where that economic power is distributed, then decides what kind of society you will have. And that was one of the most brilliant insights. And no one else before Karl Marx came out with that. And so don't read Das Kapital, but if you can read the earlier essays of Karl Marx, they are absolutely brilliant. And I think even Rawls would acknowledge that about Karl Marx.
We should teach more Marx in Hong Kong schools. So thank you. Maybe just one last question since we're running out of time. Who is your favorite political leader, first among the dead and second among the living?
Well, among the dead is easier for me. It's certainly Lee Kuan Yew. And see, because I had an opportunity, one of the greatest privileges of my life is that I've shaken hands with world leaders, dozens of them. And none of the ones I met actually were as politically shrewd, frankly, as politically cunning as Lee Kuan Yew was. And I tell you, I was in 1999, I was in a room like this, small room, but all CEOs and people like George H.W. Bush was there, Henry Kissinger was there, Zbigniew Brzezinski was there, Sam Huntington was there, really formidable meeting. And at that meeting, there was David Frost interviewing George H.W. Bush. And David Frost asked George H.W. Bush, you met so many world leaders. Who's the one world leader who impressed you the most? Within a split second, George H.W. Bush said, Lee Kuan Yew. So, that shows you that among he was an amazing figure for a leader of a very small country. His influence was outsized. Okay, so that among the living is a very difficult question.
Or comments? And do you mind introducing yourself briefly as well?
Hi, my name is Eddie Tam. Thank you very much. Brilliant presentation. I'm very happy also that India and China's relationship seems to be improving in the recent months. And you mentioned several times about the restructuring of the Security Council, but I think on record, if I'm not mistaken, actually the US, Russia, UK, and France are in support of India's rise to be accepted into the Security Council as permanent member. But I think on the record, actually China is the only one which stands in the way. Am I correct? I've just checked that there could be hints of China dropping their opposition. I hope that happens. But so that doesn't seem to jive with your explanation that it's UK which stands in the way and they don't want to give up the seat. Yeah, maybe they don't want to give up the seat, but they seem to support the inclusion of India. But whereas China, for now, I think does not.
Well, my first response to you is, whenever countries say in public that they support India, be careful. Because it's often the countries that are supporting you that are the ones that are best at undermining you. And by the way, I've seen with my own eyes, okay? Countries that in public would say, of course, we support India's inclusion. But then what you do, the way you prevent reform is that you introduce what I call poison pill amendments. And when you put in a poison pill amendment, you ensure that nobody can accept it, and therefore there can be no reform, and therefore India cannot get in. You know, there are ways and means of your real position is not what your public position is. And so I'm not sure for the record exactly what China's position is. I don't think China has opposed India's admission. But I don't know whether or not China has publicly supported also any countries. But I do believe that it is in China's national interests to see a different UN Security Council. And I would say, don't listen to what countries say, observe what is their national interests. And that will tell you what their real position will be. Incidentally, in my book, The Great Convergence, you'll find that I have proposed a 7-7-7 formula, 7 permanent members, 7 semi-permanent members, and 7 elected members. And the reason why I propose 7 semi-permanent members is because for every country that wants to get in, there's a neighbor that says, why not me? So India wants to get in, Pakistan says, why not me? Japan wants to get in, South Korea says, why not me? Brazil wants to get in, Argentina says, why not me? But the most brilliant ambassador to the UN, I remember, was the Italian ambassador, because in the 1990s, when everybody was pushing for Japan and Germany to become permanent members, the Italian ambassador got very upset. He says, why are you pushing only for Japan and Germany? We, Italy, we lost World War II also. That's a true story. Amazing. But I tell that story to tell you that the opposition to reform is very deep, very subterranean, very cunning. So don't pay attention to public statements. Watch what's going on underground.
We had a question from Professor Brian Wong.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kishore. I very much appreciate your time. It's an honor to see you here in Hong Kong again. I get a lot of questions from young secondary school students and university students in Hong Kong who are bright, ambitious, and want to contribute towards foreign policy and want to pursue a career in foreign policy. But as it stands, I think Hong Kong youth often struggle with entering into the mainland foreign ministry system and also making a difference for their own country, which is China. What advice would you give to Hong Kong youth if they want to pursue a career oriented around international affairs? And what advice would you give to the government in relation to cultivating future diplomats on behalf of China? Thank you.
Well, I think one lesson I learned now, I mean, since I was a career diplomat for 33 years, and I've stepped down. Clearly, I've now been independent for 21 years. And you can make a difference on the global scene by serving as a diplomat. And I enjoyed my 33 years as a diplomat. I mean, I learned more from my 2 years as being ambassador on the UN Security Council than I learned the previous 30 years. Because I learned how naked power is. When I tell you that geopolitics is a cruel game, I can say that with great conviction because I saw with my own eyes how cruel it is. I've seen it. But at the same time, you can also make a difference internationally and globally through various public fora and speaking out and so on and so forth. So there are lots of opportunities in terms of speaking out in the international. I know that you have done it, Brian. Daniel has done it, Cheng Li has done it, and I would say there are many opportunities to make a difference, because at the end of the day, if you are able, and I have discovered that if you want to change anything internationally, don't appeal to ideals, don't appeal to principles, appeal to the national interests of the countries. And so, if you want to try and change the China-India relationship, I try to explain to my Chinese friends and to my Indian friends why it is in their respective national interests to make the changes, not out of high principles or ideals, because at the end of the day, the real interests matter much more than all these ideals do.
Sally Chen, if I might switch gear a little bit, just ask a question about global finance. So you talked about the structural change that we've seen, but the global financial infrastructure is very much still denominated and anchored in the US dollar. So global trade, access to finance very much depend on access to dollar, including in places like Hong Kong. So how do you see this dollar dominance and the global financial infrastructure that's still very much anchored in a, say, US-centric system affect the path of globalization or structural change going forward? How does that affect dependence on dollar, if I might just ask that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The dollar is completely indispensable to the global financial system. The dollar will remain the global reserve currency for decades to come. And even if the Chinese economy becomes bigger than the US economy, and I think it could happen in, let's say, 10 to 15 years from now, the US dollar will still remain as the global reserve currency. That's a fact. But at the same time, some of the recent actions that have been taken by the US, by the West, have led to countries questioning their reliance on the US dollar. So, for example, the seizure of the Russian assets of $300 billion is clearly illegal under international law. You can't do it unless the UN Security Council mandates it, right? But that gesture has led to many countries saying, now we got to hedge our bets. We cannot put all our reserves in US dollars. So there's a progressive, very slow process of moving away from the US dollar in many years. And the other danger that the US dollar faces is that now right now, for example, when China exports cars to Argentina, it gets paid with dollars. Argentina exports beef to China, it gets paid with US dollars. Surely you can create a new mechanism using blockchain technology and all that to bypass the US dollar. That hasn't happened yet, but the pressure to look for alternatives has grown significantly. So, I mean, I don't see any substitute for the US dollar in the near future, but the reliance on the US dollar will slowly drift down.
Hi, my name's Alvina. Historically, you'd see that a nation's naval power is extremely important to its country's power position in the world. So in this current shift in the structural shift of power, how important is a nation's naval capabilities and its naval bases? And how does it play a role in terms of geopolitics? And would this actually play into US interest because it's global naval power in terms of resisting change that you've mentioned? Thank you.
Well, I must say that's a very profound question on the role of navies, right? You know, I'm not a military expert, but I have, in my book, Has China Won, actually did say that it is now pointless for United States to send aircraft carriers close to China, right? Remember that in Bill Clinton's time, in 1996, when there was a crisis between China and Taiwan, Bill Clinton sent 2 aircraft carriers. He didn't actually send them through Taiwan Straits, but he sent them close enough to say, I can control the Taiwan Straits with 2 aircraft carriers. 1996, right? 29 years have passed. Tomorrow, if there's a crisis within China and Taiwan, US cannot send 2 aircraft carriers. Because nowadays with hypersonic missile technology, aircraft carriers have become sitting ducks. In fact, it doesn't make sense to build aircraft carriers. Because they were supposed to be invincible, now they're not invincible anymore. And so, and you can see therefore, actually, again, I'm not a military expert, but what's been the most effective in most of the recent battles? Drones. Small little drones. And they're amazing that the amount of damage that can be done by little. So the nature of warfare is changing. But at the same time, I also want to emphasize that even though there are wars in Ukraine, there are wars in Gaza, most countries in the world are coming to accept that wars are stupid, And the good news for the world is that wars in general are sunset industry. There are some places where they break out, and I run something called the Asian Peace Program, by the way, at the National University of Singapore. You can Google and look at it at our website. And I assert there that wars are a result of geopolitical incompetence. The Ukraine war could have been avoided if the Europeans had shown some sensitivity of what are Russia's core national interests. It doesn't mean that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is justified, but you could have prevented it by acknowledging that Russia has got legitimate security interests. And in the same way, the Gaza war could have been avoided if the West had tried harder, pushed harder for a 2-state solution between Israel and Palestine. And I say this publicly to my Israeli friends. If I, as a friend, see you walking towards a cliff, do I say stop or do I say keep walking? I see Israel walking towards a cliff because Israel has alienated global public opinion. Very unwise, right? So, but at the end of the day, if you want to prevent wars, to go back to my earlier point, you've got to be very cunning in geopolitics, understand countries' core interests, and work around them.
Thank you. We had 2 questions, very quick. Each of you speak on that table very quickly, please.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor Mahbubani, a journalist from the South naval Media Group. I want to ask a question goes to the, you are hailed as a muse of the Asian century. So how should China, India, ASEAN, and other Asian countries can coordinate to join to shape a more inclusive and sustainable Asia century, well, based on, especially in global governance, climate response, and maybe multilateralism? Thank you.
Take the other question as well.
Thank you, Ambassador Mahbubani. So my name is Li Chen from Chinese University of Hong Kong. So my question is about the idea of multipolar world, the idea of multipolar global order. So on the one hand, it could be more inclusive, more diversified, more plural, but on the other hand, it could be more fragmented, right, more unstable. So I would like to seek your view about this multipolar global order, how it's going to look like in the coming decades. Thank you.
Two small questions with short answers.
And Mari says I have 2 minutes. By the way, I should emphasize at the outset, since you very kindly called me ambassador up there, I'm no longer an ambassador. I don't speak for anybody. I speak only for myself. And Singapore doesn't have the American tradition of keeping your title as ambassador. First question on the Asian century. As you know, I did publish a book called The Asian 21st Century. And the good news about the book was that the publisher's target was 20,000 downloads. Instead, there have been over 4.1 million downloads of the book in 160 countries. The reason I mention that is that that's an indicator that the world is psychologically preparing for an Asian century. And, but for that to happen, it's very important that Asia remains at peace. And it's actually quite amazing that we in Asia haven't had a major war. We've had skirmishes, but no major war, probably since 1979. It's quite amazing. And this is a stunning feature of Asia that no one has acknowledged. But it's, for us, for the Asian century to happen, our priority number one is make sure there's no major war. And even though there'll be competition, there'll be rivalry, there'll be tensions, okay, we can manage that. But you've got to avoid a major war. That's condition number one to ensure that the Asian century happens. Because I think the economic development momentum is real and will continue. Now on the multipolar world, I think the multipolar world is already here. It has arrived. But of course, it's fluid, because some of the powers are going up, some of the powers are going down. But this multipolar world, I think Cheng Li, you quoted J.D. Vance saying about how the multipolar world has come. And it is actually good for the world that we are having a multipolar world instead of unipolar or bipolar. Because in a multipolar world, there are more actors. And so there are more balancing forces at play in conflicts and rivalries. And it creates a multipolar world, creates more opportunities. So for example, the third independent pole that's going to emerge now clearly is India. Because there was a time when it thought that India might be moving closer to the US. Thanks to President Donald Trump, that's not going to happen. And so India is going to move back towards playing a more independent role. And that creates options for countries. And so therefore, it's a very fluid, dynamic, changing world, but the result will be a multipolar world.
Great. One very quick 30 seconds. What is your next project?
Well, I think my next project is quite simply to continue what I said in my remarks today, to try and persuade the West that it is wiser for them to create room for other new powers to emerge, because that will create a better world for the West.
Okay, thank you.